I'm telling you. Awesome. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm not going to go full screen because I had some issues with it yesterday where I went full screen and I couldn't go back. So I want to make sure that you can take control back over this. But if you guys can see my screen, for those of you who are new to IxDA, so we're very excited. So this is the local chapter, the Miami or South Florida chapter Interaction Design Association. For those of you who don't know about the IxDA and the talk that we have today, so this is super exciting. I know Claudia had been talking about this for a while as Marcelo in terms of our guest for today. So we're super happy to have Alex Mooc with us and really discussing a lot of the secrets behind the accessibility or accessible software. As you guys may know, he comes from Zoom, and so I'm sure there's probably a lot of kind of war stories he can tell you from everything that's been going on from the pandemic and how everything got kind of started. But really, I think just to set the context for IxDA, and more importantly for anyone who's joining us today. So what is the IxDA? What do we do? This is by no means a chapter that kind of got founded here in Miami, but ultimately it's an international organization. There's over 100,000 different groups. There's over 200 different groups, over 100,000 members and growing. And really, I think the purpose for our chapter, the Miami chapter of Interaction Design Association, we exist to bring designers together and really from all backgrounds, right? In domains, you probably guys have seen a recent trend that we've been hosting things around accessibility. We tend to do those in themes because we realize there's a lot more content and things that we want to cover, but really all encompassing within the realm of interaction design, user experience design, research, and so forth. This was originally founded, quite a few years ago, and this was done by our founding members from, the different groups that were here locally, primarily Sapien folks that we were able to kind of create a good connection with, and that's transitioned over the last few years with Marcelo, with Claudia joining, as of recently, myself. And this is really by no means the full spectrum. There's a lot of volunteers, a lot of people behind the scenes that make this possible. And today, especially, we're super excited, to have Alex Mooc. We have a lot of content to go through. So maybe, do you want to kind of go through that process now, Claudia, and basically talk a little bit about our guest?
Sure. Well, I would say a big thank you to Zoom for letting them share Alex with us, because everybody's working their butts off over there, and especially since they've gone through all kinds of hyper growth. But we're privileged to have Alex, dial in from us. Alex, where are you right now? You're in Seattle area, right?
No, from San Jose, which is where
awesome.
Zoom HQ is. Yeah.
Awesome. So Alex is dialing into us from Pacific time, and Alex is the accessibility lead at Zoom. Previously, he was at University of Washington doing a lot of hardcore research into accessibility and how different applications can be used by people with different disabilities. And so it's a real privilege to have somebody from an organization that really is very mature in terms of how it's built accessibility into its development process with us tonight. So if any of you have heard of the expression shift left, it refers to bringing accessibility in early in the development or design process. And Zoom is a company that's managed to bring it in probably about as far left as you possibly can. And so it's great to have somebody who's working in a company who's been very successful at incorporating accessibility to the point where it's really a core value with us today, and to be able to talk first person about what that's like. And so the rest of us are maybe talking about, oh, well, let's try to bring this into a project. Let's try to recommend this to our client. But in this case, I mean, we're blessed with having Alex here to be able to explain what it's like on the inside in a company that's doing it right. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you. Alex, maybe you want to talk to us a little bit about your background before you joined Zoom.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my background in my career growth and accessibility is closely connected with Zoom's growth and accessibility. And I say that relatively, we might be mature, but we are pretty young and going really fast. Back at the University of Washington, I studied Human-Centered Design and Engineering, HCDE, which it's an undergraduate program where we focus on UCD, heavy focus on UX research. And during that time, I worked also at the Accessibility Center, specifically Access Technology Center. And at the UW, we're very blessed to be funded, to have the Accessibility Center to be well funded and well connected in the sense that it's deeply ingrained in the procurement process. So any software that we try to procure, the accessibility team from the UW would chime in, do an audit, and
Right.
see whether or not we can purchase the software. And so specifically at the Technology Center, where I worked for about 2 years, I worked underneath a blind accessibility expert. And a lot of what I did was screener testing, keyboard testing, WCAG testing, all of that, and collaborate with companies, vendors, to bring accessibility into their roadmap. And so I'd say around 2016 might have been when Zoom came in contact with the UW.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, it was around a pilot phase, and Zoom was basically 0% accessible. You would think it's a Flash application because turn on screener, you don't hear a single peep, nothing's keyboard accessible. Lots of work had to be done. And I think before that, Zoom first came into contact with accessibility through the EDU space. I think California, the school system here, was a very big client, and they were asking for accessibility, but there was absolutely zero knowledge at Zoom. And so,
So, Alex, how far back are we talking in terms of getting Zoom involved with accessibility? We're talking 4 years, 6 years. I mean, how far back are we going?
I want to say that the first request came in sometime before 2016, so maybe 2014 or so, or whatever. But I think the efforts really accelerated with the collaboration with the University of Washington, in the sense that the way things are ran there is that we're not just auditing, providing you with issues and forcing you to go on a roadmap to fix these issues, but we want to make it a collaborative effort where your teams, your development teams, so Zoom is design, engineering, so on and so forth, can come in and empathize and learn how to create an accessibility program, not just fix issues, but build a culture.
So,
And so, go ahead, sorry.
so Zoom wasn't founded with accessibility as part of its mission. It actually started trickling in as feature requests from your user community.
I mean, accessibility from a pure UX perspective, right? We try to make it frictionless, but from an ally perspective, right? Meaning WCAG guidelines. No, that was definitely not originally, right, one of our
Mm-hmm.
development policies. But from a business perspective, since we're very heavy in the EDU space, accessibility it's a very big proposition. And so eventually, right, we baked it into our engineering policy, so that it's not just my team's responsibility, right? It's everybody's responsibility. It's if you ship code that's not accessible, then go back to drawing board and do it again. And so it was over time, right? I think after 2016, the knowledge was built. It was built into the project management policy, the development policy, so on and so forth. And so it took some time. Like I said, it was 0% accessible at the time that I was reviewing it back in college. But over time, right, we've definitely built it straight into the development process.
So I wish you hadn't said back in college, because I was going to ask you what year that was in, and I didn't want to date you there.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to get to is like kind of trying to pinpoint like when is the turning point where Zoom decided to be accessible?
I mean, again, like Eric, our CEO, very engineering minded, and he's very active in terms of working with customers. And that was basically a requirement, right? If you wanted to sign this contract with Zoom, then you had to be accessible. And so, Eric himself made the commitment, put engineering effort, and delegated to our senior architect, who basically is my boss, who leads the entire accessibility initiative from higher level perspective. Delegated him the responsibility to, hey, here are the requirements. We need to make this accessible. Let's do all we can to make sure that it becomes accessible and is sustained as we continue to build more products. So I can't give you a definite date, but it's been, there's no turning point. It's just step by step. We've been building the knowledge, right? We're how to be compliant with WCAG, and then how do we become beyond just compliant, become the most usable experience for our users with disabilities. So it's been an evolutionary process, in the past several years.
So kind of the reason why I'm asking this, Alex, is because for compared to some of the people who have been in the accessibility field, I'm a newcomer. I kind of did the shift about 3, maybe 4 years ago, from a career in UX into accessibility. And as far back as I can remember, Zoom has always been portrayed as the most accessible software. And kind of what I'm trying to drive at is it just seems like here's Zoom, which is a relatively young company. It comes out there and it manages to really take the lead in this one particular way very early on, and being able to hold on to its lead as being the most accessible video conferencing platform that's out there. So kind of what I'm trying to drive at is, how is it that you guys claimed that so quickly? And does that translate to any other field where somebody would be able to be the most accessible company in X just by doing best practices before anybody else?
Well, for us, it's a mix of, following best practices, but accessibility is a process, right? You can hit on the checklist once, but then it doesn't do anything well if you don't keep hitting the check boxes. So it's a process, and we're a program. And I think the way we build trust with our users is we have, if you open Zoom, you'll constantly see accessibility improvements. Something that might not be screen reader accessible right now will be in the next month. And that's another way that we build trust, right? If you report an issue, then, we'll process it internally, and we'll have it fixed probably within 1 or 2 release cycles, which is, I say, 1 to 3 months. And I think, I don't know when, I don't follow, the zeitgeist, and I don't know when necessarily we claim the title. But I know that what we do is we constantly listen to customers, and we constantly, release accessibility fixes, which, could be a way to build trust, right? If, you see something that's broken, tell it to us, and expect it to be fixed in the near future.
So
I have a couple of questions, Claudio, in terms
go ahead.
Before we jump into the accessibility backlog and prioritization, going back to the first days of accessibility at Zoom, how was the effort, the process of implementing the accessibility capacity inside the organization? In terms of how many people did you hire, what training, what policies? Help us understand the evolution of accessibility as a state within the organization, and then how that started to become externalized in the product.
From the earliest days, I can only tell you from a customer perspective, because that's when I was still at the University of Washington, working on from a testing perspective and on a verification perspective. But a lot of what was done early on was training, as in we would have sessions with engineering leaders, design leaders. When I was an intern at least, I had design training sessions to really build empathy with the design leaders and engineering leaders, so they can see what the expected behavior is. And then from there, right, once they learn the expected behavior, it's up to them to, build out the infrastructure for how can we continue to support accessible APIs. And so, my team, accessibility it's the responsibility of the team leaders. And so at the end of the day, how they build it within their products, how they build the internal knowledge, it's up to them. But I think from my perspective, right, a lot of what we did was training. A lot of what we did was bringing, for instance, like a blind user into the room and seeing, okay, here's this flow that you created. Here's how it works with a keyboard. It doesn't work. Here's how it works. Here's how it sounds with the screen reader, right? It sounds like this, right? Would you be happy if you were this user and had to experience this way? And just from that, right, I think we were able to, the leaders at least, were able to like quickly strategize and come up with how do we support this from a coding perspective, and then disseminate it to all the different team members.
So you would do a show and tell with the leaders or with the entire team?
Honestly, the entire team. At the time, we were smaller, but the leaders were always included. And at this point, right, the leaders, they weren't leaders back then, but now they have their team on their own. And so, they're able to instill that culture into their team. And if not, right, basically we have a very robust QA process. When it comes to education, we don't ask developers to come in necessarily with accessibility knowledge, but it's something that we build as we work with them, because we track every single release, every single feature. It's vetted by our accessibility QA analysts. And when we work with them, right, we try to explain things in a way that helps them empathize with the situation. Here's if you don't do it this way, here's how it might affect this end user. And so the more we work with them, right, the more they'll figure out, okay, this is what to look out for. This is how I do this accessibly. And so it's very informal, but I guess the quote unquote policing builds in knowledge internally.
Go ahead, Claudia. How do you compare that with where you are right now? Do you feel like a similar
I can't. Quite honestly, I can't. It's kind of what made me want to have Alex come and join with us is because I felt like his experience was so unique in terms and so different from probably what all of us here are experiencing in South Florida. So, even like I'm probably one of the very few that are blessed with being a full-time accessibility professional. And so there's very few, I can probably count on one hand the number of people who have those sorts of positions in South Florida. And then the rest are trying to kind of like talk our clients or talk our employers into observing just the bare minimum of best practices. So part of the reason why I wanted to have Alex here today was because this is like, this is like what we want to be doing. This is what we want to be aspiring to. So that's kind of where this came from. So
I say that Zoom, we're lucky in the sense that it comes from the CEO down to the team, right? It's not an initiative that starts maybe within UX team, then we have to grow externally and get, buy-in support from, engineering, QA, whatever, right? It comes from the top down and, it disseminates pretty easily. And so I think we're fortunate for having, a CEO that's engineering minded, process minded, and understands accessibility and its value.
And it's so true. I don't know if you've been following the whole thing that came out last year around the diverse-ish hashtag. And so essentially diverse-ish is a company that's into diversity, but doesn't translate what they're doing as far as diversity and inclusion goes to people with disabilities. And so somebody came up, if you look up diverse-ish in YouTube, there's some incredibly funny but painful sort of videos about companies trying to put on their game face from a PR point of view, talking about, hey, yeah, we're all inclusive, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, and disabilities are great, wonderful. 2019 is going to be a great year to be disabled. I mean, saying things that are just absolutely appalling like this. And you're going like, would my CEO do that? Would my CEO stumble right into this? Does this reflect my company's policy? And the painful answer is, when you're kind of looking at that and go like, well, maybe or yes. So part of what I loved about Zoom is, your story is that you guys have been accessible from the start. You've been into this from the beginning. This is part of the core values of your company. And it's not the old cliche like the CEO's son has a severe disability or something. It's because I don't know. I mean, that's actually a good question. What is it that made it a core value at Zoom?
I mean, there's, at the end of the day, there's a business aspect to it in the sense that, especially in the EDU space, accessibility is a requirement, right? If your product's accessible, then it's more likely to be purchased. So there's a big, business component to it. But, if you ask your CEO, right, he'll explain to you the business aspect to it, but also he'll explain to you the humanitarian aspect of it, right? Which is, there's users that literally can't use your product. And I think with Zoom, it's a communication software, and reliability, right, is one of the number one key principles that we have to strive for. And I think if you're not accessible, then, it fails on you as a video conferencing service. And I talk about accessibility, not just for disability, right, but for any other user groups. And so accessibility, right, in terms of supporting WCAG and users with disabilities coincides really well with our other core values, which is accessibility and simplicity of our products, making it easy to join a meeting and easy to have a reliable service to communicate with someone else.
Wow. I mean, honestly, that's a pretty strong statement because, you get other companies like WebEx that feel like, almost like they could write VPAT statements to allow them the freedom of not being fully accessible. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement that, to be accessible is really a requirement for somebody in your space.
Right.
So Claudio, go ahead, Alex.
I was just about to say, right, I think we're at a time where it's even more important because I think a lot of these universities, they don't have the accessibility team or the investment in their accessibility auditing team to make these type of decisions. Like at the University of Washington, it's basically the accessibility team has the ability to stop a deployment of a product if it's not accessible. But you'll see at some other universities where they might not even get access to the conversation until it's already bought and purchased in contract. But as we're seeing, the procurement policies evolve to be more accessible, then, you'll probably start to see more SaaS software be accessible.
Well, you just did a segue for me into two like really important points. I mean, I'm going to address the first one, which is about procurement, which is, it almost seems like universities and higher ed are the only ones that have like these sort of procurement policies where you must have products that are accessible from your vendors. And so your vendors have to have accessible products if you're going to do business with them. The second one is like you came into Zoom from the University of Washington, if I'm getting my facts right, and your background there was doing hardcore user testing with people with disabilities or hardcore accessibility testing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, my job there was essentially, I was an accessibility analyst. We'd work with a large range of different vendors, whether it's in pilot phase or even internal developers, right? I'm developing this website for our department. And then we'd have folks from all around the universities come in and essentially ask for feedback. And my boss himself, Hadi Rangan, was or still is an accessibility specialist who himself is blind, worked under John Gunderson at I think Illinois. And so working under him, I think I was able to working on him with it as an analyst, and so helping him on a day-to-day basis with his daily needs. I was able to gain a good sense of empathy for what a screen reader user, a blind user, goes through, seeing what happens when there's a barrier, right? The frustration, the anger that might occur, and then the smiles that he might get from an accessible experience. I think working in the department gave me that ability to empathize and really see through his eyes, what he was going through. And I think it's one thing that's lacking in universities is education and accessibility. And at that time where I was getting paid for it, it was a job, but I really saw it as, a training program. It was a class that I took, for 20 hours a week for about 2 years, right? Where I basically got to understand what it felt like to be an assistive technology user. And so, I think I learned a lot in terms of, ways that WCAG might fall short, right? You might design or create something that meets the guidelines, but how that in itself also may not mean it's fully accessible. It might be technically accessible, but might not be usable. And so I learned how to, go beyond just compliance and create experiences that are usable, actually usable for users with disabilities.
So that kind of leads us into an interesting point, which is like, when is it like the best point to introduce somebody to accessibility? I mean, my personal opinion, I think it's like in high school or in undergrad. And Marcelo and I are both kind of blessed with a situation where we're able to teach in a lot of the tech boot camps. And there's a lot of folks here from IronHack that are here on the call today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think I can't even stress enough how important it is to teach that early on in someone's career. And I kind of was in the reverse situation where I had a 20+ year career in UX and as a creative director. And then I kind of transitioned to accessibility from that. But it's so important to teach it, early on in a career to get somebody fired up about it. Now, in terms of the sort of recruiting that Zoom does, is that something you guys look for? Do you guys read people's resumes to see if they have accessibility in the background? Or is it more like you're trying to get the best and the brightest and you're hoping that they're open-minded enough because you're going to teach them accessibility while they're at Zoom?
It's definitely the latter. I mean, of course, we're talking about my team, right? You would need accessibility expertise to be an accessibility expert, but for any other team, we expect you to grow and learn. And I think that's one of the big traits that we hire for. A personnel trait is that someone who's willing to grow and learn. We will usually take a shot on like younger professionals as opposed to more seasoned veterans because we
Right.
know that they can grow and like soak in all the information. And like I said, we have like a very robust process when it comes to like vetting for accessibility, auditing for accessibility.
Right.
And so we know that if you come in, you'll come in contact with the accessibility team and eventually learn from us what you should or should not do. And so I think we don't hire for accessibility background because it's something that you really teach, but we hire for personality, for someone who will take that teaching and apply it to their work.
But to that point, as you're hiring people, let's just say the design team is hiring designers, and they are not being asked to know about accessibility. How is accessibility baked into the design process? And this is a question that came from Wes Brown. Thanks for that question. How is that baked into the design process in a way that will engage that training, that learning about accessibility?
Yeah, I think we're fortunate in that a lot of our principles in design, the principles of our design team falls pretty well in hand with accessibility, in that we try to keep things very simple, limit the amount of steps, follow standards, best practices, write things that are easily recognizable. And so very rarely will I have to have a conversation with designer. Hey, this element, this structure is very confusing. It will not work for a screener. It won't work for keyboard testing. And so I find that on a day-to-day, I don't have to interact with designers because a lot of what
they already know.
They might know, but also like just in general, by following good practices and good design principles, like it saves you from even having these issues with accessibility. I mean, the only things we consider, right, usually maybe labeling, color contrast, and there's excessive motions, which we don't use. And all of these different like small things that, you know, the WCAG principles like use of color, contrast, that's baked into their design guidelines.
Right.
But usually, right, what you worry about when working with designers is this interaction is totally unusable, cannot be scaled for assistive technologies. Usually I find that we don't do those to begin with. It's ingrained in our design principles. And that's what I mean. It's our design principles fall really good hand in hand with accessibility principles. But
could you share an example of a user interaction where you had to say, oh, what about this, right? What about thinking in a different path to make it scalable, to make it accessible?
Well, you can think of bad examples, right? If you think about, imagine, right, combining two standard elements into one. Maybe you have
No,
I think we lost it.
did the internet just go?
oh, I'm back.
No.
Oh, he's back.
He's back.
Okay,
Awesome.
As I was saying, yeah, I can think of bad examples, right? If you have like a combo box and then you nest like a tree view inside it, right? You could technically make that accessible, but it would be a nightmare to learn and understand as a screen reader user, as a keyboard user. And in general, right, we don't do these things. We try to keep things simple. We try to use standard elements. And we try to keep a very clean color palette, so on and so forth. And so that makes my job easy, as in I don't have to constantly be policing them, and I can trust that their designs are accessible. But other than that, right, we'll usually chime in. We'll look at the final designs. Okay, this color pass, this lighting pass. Is there feedback when we need to, etc. And like only in features that really affect users with disabilities, such as like video layouts, closed captioning, things like this, that's when we'll jump in more seriously during the ideation phase and the wireframing and all that.
So let's talk maybe about the customer journey, because I feel like that's probably the area, Alex, where you're most accessible. You know, where you guys have created a customer journey with all kinds of different modalities of being able to access it and work there. When did that come up? I mean, when did you guys concept that? Because that's about as far left as you could go in the software development lifecycle.
I'm sorry, could you like reframe the question? I'm not sure what the question is.
So in terms of
creating user stories that
right,
with accessibility in mind.
And the customer journey, you know, and how you go through that user experience. Because it's one thing to talk about visual design, but it's another thing to talk about like the different steps that it takes to be able to go through your journey using your product. You know, how did that arise?
Right. I wouldn't say, I wouldn't attribute that to our accessibility team, right? I think what I focus on is compatibility with accessibility software with different needs, right? And like, I mean, I'll repeat what I said, right? It's the design principles that we follow to begin with, right? Limiting the amount of steps, using standard controls. I think we hire for these type of designers, and I think that's the type of product philosophy that we strive for. And so there's no, our team doesn't work directly to enforce that left shifting user experience. It's something that it's ingrained in our design philosophy.
So let me bring up another issue, which is cost. Okay, and for companies that are new to accessibility or who have been audited or sued and feeling like they have to go fix a process that's not accessible, it's really expensive because you have to go and you have to rewire everything, you have to rework everything. And you guys, are on the other end of the spectrum where you're thinking about accessibility from the start. So for a company that has to redo stuff, there's definitely enormous costs in terms of having to go backwards and having to step back. But from your point of view, is there an added cost for accessibility?
There is cost sometimes, but for the most part, we say no. It's free as long as you follow best practices, and it's probably better for you in the long run economically. There's some examples in that we might have some legacy code base which might not support keyword accessibility, and it might involve an entire rework of the component refactoring. There's small instances like that, but we don't view accessibility as a cost, right? It's something it's good quality code, and if you think that's a cost that's not worth paying for, then I think there's other things wrong with your company. And
wait,
so
I think I have a T-shirt that says something about that.
Uh-huh.
And I think here at Zoom, a lot of developers, we take pride in accessibility. We've gone to this point where we've had a reputation in that we take pride in that, hey, our code is more accessible than yours. And so it's almost at this point where it's like a healthy competitive mentality that our team has to how can we make it even more accessible.
Okay, let me invite the audience to ask questions. I don't think we have a Q&A room, but we can definitely post your questions on the chat button, and I'm reading through those. Claude, may I introduce a question from of the attendants?
Right, from Praveen, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Go for that.
Yeah. So Praveen is asking, how can third-party developers integrate their accessibility-oriented features in Zoom? So do you have an external API for external development community to build on Zoom?
We do, and I think I personally wouldn't be the right person to speak to. We have our own developer advocates that do this full time, but we have an SDK, we have an API where you can build on top of Zoom and create your own integrations. In terms of accessibility features, I'm not sure what specifically that's referring to.
So we've been experimenting on a weekly basis at our various meetups. It's like some of you guys might have been at the Boca.js meetup recently, and that was a big failure where we couldn't get the audio to work on the live stream. So we've been iterating fast, but there's always something up. And even this weekend, we had some issues with it. Usually the audio fails when we try to add different devices.
Mm. So it seems like you're encountering like stability and reliability issues.
I think it's like, it's not that. It's Zoom is stable enough. It's more like when Zoom gets access to a microphone, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be working, but then and everyone seems to be fine, but on the stream itself, like the person who's the host, that person's muted, but you can hear the typing. That's what happened to our Boca.js meetup last few days ago. It's like those little things where I think even like a two-way dialogue, we can report issues, so you can look at them as well. in fact, I don't think it's an API issue. I think it's just something that like might be even more driver level. And how do we get around that?
Mm. Yeah, I think I can't speak to what specific issue you're having. That actually might be an issue I've experienced with Zoom itself, but I think it's kind of the segue, right? It's a good reason for why Zoom in itself has become a very popular platform among the accessibility community, because it just works. In that if you're able, it's not just about accessibility, right? It's reliability of the audio, the video, and if you can get that to work, that's accessibility, right? It's not just supporting assistive technologies; it's the reliability of the audio, video, and not having you as an end user having to fuss with all these things. It limits the amount of possible steps that you might have to troubleshoot if it can be done magically for you. But I'm sorry that you experienced these things.
Thanks for the question, Praveen. Claudio, I want to propose something because I want to plug the live transcript feature in the session tonight.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, which was kindly provided by Zoom. And it's working pretty strongly. I can see just like even me with accent, with my Brazilian accent. So you can definitely see it's translating very well. It's even capitalized Brazilian. So it's very impressive. So can we talk about how this feature came to life from the beginning as far as you know about it, and the design challenges that your design team face or continues to face in order to evolve this feature?
I think this was announced in Enterprise Connect 2018, as in where that product decision came from. I'm not sure, but I can tell you about some of the design challenges that we're facing right now. And since that it's still in beta, and I don't know how easy or not easy it is to read for most of you, but with closed captioning, we have to be really careful about how we display it in terms of limiting the potential migraines that our users have. And so how big do we make, how long do we make the lines, how many lines do we make it, how does it progress from paragraph to paragraph? Because right now you can see that it expands and contracts, it expands and contracts. There's other things like how do you limit obstruction of content, right? What if I'm sharing a screen? What if someone's video is there? How do we limit the obstruction of content in a way that is graceful, that doesn't like waste screen real estate? And I think I had a discussion with you, Claudio, and Marcelo the other day about it is the eye gaze, right? Eye contact. If closed captioning at the bottom, then you wouldn't be looking at your camera. And I think you guys brought up a real interesting point that it affects trust if you guys are not making direct eye contact with the camera. And so there's that.
Let me elaborate on that a little bit for everybody else, kind of give a little bit more context where basically it's a big ethical design issue in terms of how close you place your content to the camera. So if you place it right by the camera, you're going to be making eye contact with the camera and you're going to be establishing trust. But if you have somebody who's hard of hearing and the titles are at the bottom of the screen, then their eyes are going to be as far removed from the camera as you could get, which is going to make
like myself, I keep going up
exactly.
and down.
It's going to make you look shifty on camera. It's going to make you seem less trustworthy. So it becomes this sort of ethical design issue that because of the placement that you have for your titles, you're making a certain part of your audience appear less trustworthy. And that has profound implications. So Alex, I'm sorry I cut you off, but I just want to make sure everybody understood that before you started giving an answer.
No, that was a great explanation. And yeah, just to add on to what I was saying, I think apart from live transcription, closed captioning in general is a very big task in the sense that it's not just live transcription. We're looking at card captioning, professional human type captions, and thinking about how we position live transcription as opposed to card captioning. Because I think me as an accessibility advocate, live transcription, automatically transcribe captions is great, but it's no replacement for card captioning. And if we start providing this feature so widely, right, what would that do to event organizers who feel, oh, I have automatic captioning, that means I don't need card captioning? And so for me at least, how we present this feature is going to be a challenge in terms of how can we bolster the card captioning capabilities so that it catches up and stays in line with live transcription.
Yeah, I mean, it's and live transcription is a little bit different than having a transcript, right? Because a transcript, I've seen it on Zoom where you have, like, you identify all the speakers and it's amazing. But when you're doing live transcription, to do it right, there has to be a certain sort of lag. So if we're jumping back and forth between speakers, it's easy for that to be out of sync and for you to lose track of who's speaking, right?
Just to say, so okay, we there's automatic captioning, and the way we point it is live transcription, and then there's card captioning, which is professional human type captions. So just to clarify, which one were you referring to just now?
Oh, no, I was talking about the automatic stuff, not the card captioning.
Okay. And you're talking about the speaker identification.
Exactly.
Right. That's yeah, another design challenge that we're trying to work through is in that if you view in the transcript, you can see who's saying what, but then how do we provide the same experience to the subtitle view?
Right.
Additionally, how you might see it in broadcast TV is that they'll, at the beginning of the line, they'll put someone's name, colon, then it'll keep showing it'll roll up with whatever the person is saying. But I think with our technology, where, you know, what we can do is gracefully show who is speaking, all the while keeping that static so that as they keep speaking, right, we'll keep showing the new captions and you can still see who's speaking. If you think about broadcast TV, someone might be speaking paragraphs, and if you're not paying attention, you don't know who the speaker is anymore because it's rolled up way up in the captions. But there's that, and design consideration is how do we design it in a way that doesn't obstruct the content, doesn't take too much space away from the video to one forefront. But I think speaker identification in the subtitle view is a pretty big feature request that I've gotten from a lot of customers.
It's an evolution, right? So, so you got the feature launched, and now it's a matter of evolving that feature over time with the prioritization of other features as well. So I think that's where business value comes to balance with the user needs. So where do we come? Because at the end of the day, they need to marry. I know Joe talks about that a lot in this realm. So
yeah, it's, you know, we've had customer ask for, is there a way for me to disable the transcript view on the right side, because I don't want people to be copying pasting, to be taking screenshots of the entire transcript for privacy reasons. Ooh. But, you know, this transcript view is, you know, tremendously useful from an accessibility perspective. It helps you cognitively. If you have problems with the language, you can read and catch up and all of that. It's an accessibility feature, right? But, you know, there's times when you got to think about the trade-off between privacy and security with accessibility.
Right, and you know, I've worked with like transcripts and text, you know, with Immersive Reader, for instance, in Microsoft, where actually if you can sync the text with what's going on with the audio, it actually helps your concentration. Now, that's incredibly difficult to pull off in a live context where that lag actually gives the AI a little bit of extra time to work and actually give you more accuracy with your captions. So there is certainly a trade-off that's happening there.
Yeah.
Right.
So can I add a couple of things here, because I just checked the transcript panel, and it does have the speaker in the identification. So I think that's another powerful. So you have the live captioning on the bottom, but you also have the live transcript panel, which you can search as well. So that's I never saw that feature in Zoom before. This is great.
No,
so
I thought the other day when
Jonathan,
yeah, and you know, the thought is we already have speaker identification in the transcript view, and should we put it within the subtitle view, right? Is it worth it? Because if it's in transcript view, you're looking left and right, and doing left and right all the time will hurt your eyes. And so, you know, we have a workaround, but then is it worth doing the full solution, right? These are all the considerations that comes with trying to prioritize these features.
You know, and I know that captioning is like a pet area of yours, Alex. I mean, is there anything else that you would want talk about in terms of what Zoom is doing regarding to captioning before we move on to another area where there's a lot of questions with people asking about COVID. So anything you want to say about captioning?
Well, a lot of the work right now, I think a big goal of mine from a product perspective is how can we make it easier to integrate as a card provider into Zoom. Right now we have, an API token, API integration where you copy an API token, send it to the captioner, and then they'll do all the work. But as we're seeing more and more use cases of card providers trying to use Zoom, right, there's many different aspects of their business processes that we're not considering in terms of how they schedule things, how they caption things, and different technologies they use. They might use speech recognition, like a Dragon. They might use a steno machine. They might use text abbreviations, and all of that plays very differently into how they're outputted. And I think a big goal of ours is going to be to understand that field, right? And how do we create an experience that makes it easy to provide card captioning for Zoom?
Okay, just a quick second. For those who are new to accessibility, CART is essentially human transcription services where somebody is listening to what we're saying right now and transcribing something on like a machine that's comparable to a court stenographer.
Exactly.
Does that stand to anything like CART?
Communication, access, real-time translation.
You're better than me on that.
I had to Google it. So
I would have failed that question on the exam.
I would Google. So
that's what it's there for.
All right. Do you wanna move to another topic?
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. I mean, because I see a slew of questions here related to COVID and kind of let's pull out a couple different threads. I mean, first of all, everybody suddenly had to do work from home, and Zoom really became an enabler of that and really made it possible for a lot of us to be able to work from home and stay connected. It also put huge taxes on, put a huge tax on your ability to service all those people, because you went within a few weeks from 10 million users to over 30 million daily sessions. So I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I was just trying to remember the exact term that it was. It was like unique daily participants. So you guys went through whatever you wanted to do, that a hyper growth that would have broken most companies. And most companies would have had their service model, their customer service, I mean, something or other breakdown, like let's look at the Florida Unemployment Office or any of these sort of organizations that could not handle the sudden load that was put on them. And somehow Zoom managed to adapt to that. And you guys also managed to put out patch after patch, like new releases almost nightly at a certain point. So I imagine it's calmed down a little bit, but certainly there's so much to be said about hypergrowth there. There's so much to be said about Zoom becoming like this sort of cultural icon in the face of COVID. And then there's any sort of learnings that you may have come from this whole experience. So yeah, I'll let you at it.
I mean, first off, right, big props to our engineering ops, DevOps, infrastructure teams for being able to develop a system that can be scaled overnight for 30-fold. And I think right now things aren't necessarily ticking down per se. I think in our security freeze, we're holding off a lot of features. And at this point that we're out of the security freeze, we're trying to sprint and catch up. So things are as hectic as ever. And, we're hiring like crazy, essentially. I think, at least for my work in accessibility, a big part of what's made it easier is that there's been a lot of fires to put out in the sense that I see a lot of use cases for how users with disabilities might connect through Zoom. There's some users that dial in specifically through a phone. They never even touch a computer. Mm-hmm. There's others that dial in through their audio so they can have like their video relay service, like sign language interpretation onto the Zoom call. There's many of these different use cases for it. You don't assume they all use the happy path to connect with Zoom. There are so many options that we provide. And having to support all of those in such time of dire demand has been really difficult. But what's made it easy is in that structurally we're very horizontal in terms of leadership and management. And there's a very strong culture of helping one another. And so it's made, at least my job, accessibility, which in itself is a very cross-functional job, right? It's made it a lot easier to rally stakeholders to, create accommodation for use cases that we've needed accommodations. Another big part of accessibility, right, is support. In that we have support, of course, at Zoom, but dedicated accessibility support will ultimately have to go to my team in the sense that we don't have anybody trained yet to give a blind user instructions for how to sign up, for how to do things. So my team has had to take on, the entire responsibility of building the support program for Zoom, which is something that we didn't really have to think about before this, but now, right, I get maybe like 30 support emails a day in which I have to handle. And so we're looking beyond just compliance in our development process, but we're looking at how can we build an accessible support program. I think, as an example, Microsoft is a very good example of this, to have what's it called, the electronic disability answer desk, right, which is basically what I do, but its own separate department. And I think that's something that, we have to look to scale past COVID.
So I was watching, because I want to touch base on a deaf user, because we don't talk much about that segment. First, they don't see themselves as people with disability, right? And they have a linguistic mismatch, as Marie Van Dreschi, I hope I'm pronouncing her name. So there's a talk I can share with the community on the chat. She's deaf, she's a designer, and she gives some design tips on how to design for the deaf. In terms of the contact us page, we always put the phone number there, but someone who's deaf won't be able to call. So I'm curious to hear from the accessibility aspect at Zoom, how are we trying, if you are trying to address that segment of users?
Yeah,
I hope it's not a difficult question.
It's, I think past COVID, right, there's been very big demand in that a lot of schools went virtual, and then a big portion of them are ASL speakers, and that we've seen a lot of gaps in that space, in the sense that this product was designed to, for instance, active speaker view. It switches based on who's speaking. And so it's using an audio cue to switch the video. But someone who's signing, right, it's a very different experience because there's no audio cue. And essentially what that means is that there's decreased participation because their video is not being put at the forefront. And so there's improvements that can be done with that. And even simple things like whoever is currently speaking, whoever has the audio channel will get a higher fidelity video, which is problematic because if the video thumbnail of the interpreter, the ASL interpreter, or someone who's signing is low, you can't lip read, you can't read the signs, it's problematic. There's video quality, right, active speaker, there's things like layout, just basic layout, right? You want to be able to see multiple interpreters at once while being able to see the video at once, while being able to see the presenter, the presentation. And so we've seen this need for a more flexible layout within Zoom as we listen and hear to all these needs from ASL users. And so it's a very big field. I think I myself was, I'd say, blindsided by, in the sense that when I came up through university, I was very focused on, keyboard testing, accessibility for screen readers, maybe for low vision. And in the back of my mind, I always thought, deaf, hard of hearing, okay, just provide closed captioning, provide an interpreter, and that's a go. But then when you move over to Zoom, where it's heavily about communication, audio is a big aspect of it. And for use group that doesn't have audio, right? How do we create an equitable experience? It's a very big design challenge that is it's beyond just developing an accessible development policy, but it's about like building accessibility into our product roadmap, in the sense that how we create these features that might support the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Right. Let me just do a quick plug on the inclusive design effort in the entire industry. So the difference between having an accessible product and designing with inclusion in mind. So I think that it's a pairing effort, right? So starting with the blind user with assistive technology in mind is definitely helpful, but there's also other areas that as a designer, we should all be including into a design process. Go ahead, Claudia.
Well, we have a few questions, and I don't know if maybe we should start transitioning into taking questions from everybody, but we do have a few questions in chat. We have one from Peter McNally, who's joining us from New England. And, he's talking about like the growth related to COVID. And he's wondering if you've learned anything new about accessibility or with your customers with disabilities in the last few months.
Yeah, I mean, essentially a lot of what I described has been things that, was kind of vaguely familiar with, but wasn't directly exposed to on a regular basis up until COVID, where everybody really had to use Zoom. Stuff with ASL interpretation, things. So, with our focus on privacy, before you had the ability to mute and unmute people, right? But because of, an effort to protect privacy, right, unmuting someone might be a little bit over the edge in terms of privacy. So we've eliminated that feature, but I've seen and I've talked to users where it's actually a big issue, right? There's some users that can't move. They might be paraplegic, and so they would have maybe a caretaker set up Zoom so they can participate in whatever session it is. And so it used to be very powerful for a host to be able to unmute someone so that they didn't have to press the button themselves so they can be allowed to talk. But, with this recent shift in security, right, we had to make the trade-off where, okay, suddenly you can't just unmute someone, right, because of privacy reasons. And so I think it's not done, and that we're still looking for solutions for this use case. But there's every day, right, I receive an email about this specific use case, this specific set of abilities that we might not support. And to that question, there are many things I've learned in different use cases. Maybe even things like you can dial into a Zoom meeting, but then the password, if it's too long, if you have the prompt, it takes too long for you to type in. And so we got to think about, okay, how do we extend the password timeline and all that? And so many, many different use cases that we've encountered since the launch of COVID.
So of all of those, is there one that stands out? Because I have another question about what's the top feature request you've seen in light of COVID? So in the last few months, is there anything that stands out more than anything else?
Oh, absolutely. It would be the sign language interpretation and support for it. The customized layout, that is always number one back in mind. It's one of those issues that keeps me from sleeping sometimes, in the sense that our security fees was so difficult. We had so many people request it, and we understand the absolute value of being able to have these layouts, but not being able to do something about it because we're in a freeze. It was definitely taxing, but I think we're on our way to figuring out a solution.
Well, let's spend a minute or two on that freeze. I mean, the freeze happened why? Because you guys went through hyper growth, and then you had to really focus on certain issues before you got to other ones, right?
Exactly. And, that didn't mean accessibility was thrown out the window. Essentially, bugs, improvements, stuff on the back end was definitely still things up for grabs. In fact, I think it made it easier for me to go through my backlog of accessibility issues because we had some engineers with a lot more time since they were making new features. But in this case, right, better layouts, support for ASL interpretation, it's less of a backend improvement, but more of a new feature. In that sense, we just couldn't prioritize it in the backlog.
I have a little group of questions around people with disabilities. Give me just a sec. So is there an effort to hire people with disabilities as Zoom? And are there disabled people on the team? And then the other thing is, how do you, if you do have those people, how do you include them into the development dialogue? Is it for user testing? So if you give us a little bit more insight on that.
I'd say right now we're still very young in that inclusive hiring is not something that I've even begin to look at. And so I think ideally we would want to hire persons with disabilities to come on our team to provide their expertise. A lot of what I do is basically learn secondhand, right? I'll jump on any call to learn what the experience is, but having someone within our team to help empathize and drive these product decisions, right, I think will be the way forward. Because they say, it's not for us without us. And so I think what you mentioned, right, inclusive hiring people with disabilities has to be in our roadmap if we want to consider continuing maturing Zoom's accessibility program.
Yeah, I mean that is such an amazing conundrum, because it's kind of like we live in this sort of apartheid now, where those of us who are able to work and those of us who are disabled are kind of marginalized in one way or another. But it's kind of an astonishing statement that without having inclusive hiring practices, that Zoom has been able to actually take the lead in accessibility. And yet, on the other hand, that it's kind of like, yes, you're looking forward to, like, when can we start bringing in all these people with disabilities? So it's I think it really speaks to that sort of conundrum. Um, but going forward, I mean, if budget and release cycles and time weren't a constraint, I mean, how would you think of incorporating people with disabilities into your development process?
I think working closely with the design and product team, right, to drive the product decisions, identifying user stories, improvements, tasks, right, being a product manager for that field, that's where I could see these users helping us. Of course, screen reader testing, right, someone who's an expert in screen readers, right, could provide way better feedback than I could, but also like provide areas of improvement. So like, okay, we follow WCAG principles, what can we do better? How can we things better? Like right now, what we're doing is if you turn on a screen reader in a very large meeting, like a webinar, you might be inundated with information, in the sense that we try to make everything that's visually seen, make it also audibly heard, right? It's provide an equal experience. And so someone's leaving, someone's entering, someone's sending a chat, you'll get a notification for each one of those. And even though it's an equal experience and it's technically accessible, right? Think about the experience for someone who has to listen to this like for an entire 1 hour. It's noisy, and it basically like takes away from your cognitive thinking abilities. And so
Right.
our right for how to curb this, right, just provide customizability for what you want to hear, what you don't want to hear, things like that, right? These little enhancements to the user experience to take it beyond just an equitable experience, but actually a very good experience for someone who might be disabled. That perspective, things like that, right? I've been able to learn from my former mentors and speaking with other users. They're bringing someone on board who, immediately has these ideas without us having to do extensive research, right? Would be really useful in terms of driving the product decisions in what we build.
Awesome. I think, because we're about an hour and a little bit in, I'd love to start opening this up to questions. So if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask and they'd like to unmute themselves and be able to ask the question directly of Alex, that would be great, because I think we're roughly caught up with the questions that have come in through chat.
Yeah, hi Alex, this is Jonathan. I just want to know like what made you want to take this career path, and like what's your main driver, what keeps you motivated?
Basically, like I said, I started in accessibility when I was in college sophomore year, and I started working at the Accessibility Center. At the time, I had no idea if this was going to be, a long-term thing. I'm like, oh, cool, I could do some user testing. It seems like it's kind of up the path of becoming a UX designer, UX researcher. And so I felt like it was relevant job experience, and I took it. And, having my boss himself was blind, and having to see him, right, interact with inaccessible software, the pain that I saw in him, and like just the inability to do basic tasks, right? Once you see that, like, I don't know how you can go back and think, okay, inaccessible code is okay. And so I think I always relate it back to that experience, right? I want to make Zoom accessible to like put a smile on his face. And it's like, at least for me, right, the humanitarian aspect of it, right? I'm like, if I move into another field, right, I could be maybe a designer, UX researcher with an emphasis on accessibility, but the amount of impact that would have in terms of overseeing the entire product's accessibility, I wouldn't be able to do. And I thought that it would have been kind of like wasted experience, skill, mentoring if I just didn't do this thing full time.
Thank you.
So what was that moment? What happened to you sophomore year that suddenly made you want to pursue this as a profession?
He's a true empath.
I mean, he was very much, like a father figure to me, right? I wasn't just like his work assistant, right? I would help him through, things like I'd take him downtown to get his passport, help him with a bunch of other things. And essentially he became like a father figure to me. And like, I always think back, right? It's like, what would he want if I was making this design decision, this life decision? And I think I spent so much time. I spent 2 years, right, working 20 hours a week doing this type of stuff, and I think it's become so ingrained in me, and it was like probably the most valuable skill that I was able to get out of college compared to the other things I've learned. And that I'm like, this is where my skill lies. This is where I think I've had others in the community rely on me to provide this type of work. And so I think it was a no-brainer, and especially since Zoom was very open to bringing me back to do this.
So if you were to give an advice to someone like Jonathan or any other community, I don't put Jonathan on the spot, but for a community member, like a recent graduate from a UX boot camp, or someone starting on a product design career, what would you recommend they do in order to learn from someone with disability?
In terms of getting connected with someone with disability, I don't know how to speak to that, but there's things you can do even without waiting to know someone with disability, right? Maybe you guys have touched on it, but testing stuff yourself, like taking away your mouse for a week so you can interact with your products. Sometimes turning on a screen reader and see how the experience is like. And I think you'll essentially, I remember our in the design had eye issues for a day. Like he couldn't see bright images, and so he really can see screen. He had to turn on a screen reader just to try to listen to, how Zoom worked. And at the time, right there, it was plagued with some issues, and he was horrified by basically the experience for the screen reader. And in itself, even without, meeting with someone who might be blind, right, you get a very strong sense of what it's like just by using those technologies. And sometimes what I used to do when I was very early on in my career was just turn on my screen and try my best to complete a task with the screen reader, with the keyboard, with the screen off. And it's a powerful experience. And in terms of like getting connected and working with the disability community, I'm sure there's many ways to do so. I'm not knowledgeable enough because I came up from the University of Washington, where there's been a lot of resources allocated to do such things. And so I don't know really how it is maybe in the Florida educational system, whether there might be these type of programs, jobs, where you can kind of learn, pick up assistive technologies and accessible testing and best practices.
I hate to say you guys are years and years ahead of us.
Okay.
So if you can fathom that, here you are apologizing. We're going like, no, that's not actually the case. You guys are way ahead of us on that.
Oh, virtual now. So there are a bunch of communities that everyone can join virtually and connect with people with disabilities and learn from them. That also, at least that's my quick tip, is that's how I am trying to learn, is go on YouTube. There are a bunch of people with disabilities on YouTube trying to convey their struggles just so better products come to life. So go ahead, Jonathan, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, because User Defenders is a cool podcast I listened to, and they had an accessibility panel. And I think her name was Mina Markham or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
She mentioned exactly that. When they asked her, like, what would you do or what would you recommend to people who are trying to understand how to design for accessibility, the first thing she said was, try to operate, a website without a mouse and just use a keyboard. Just really get into their shoes and figure out like how they're able to maneuver with the everyday things that we have that they can't really work with.
Yeah, that's one thing that I always do in our training sessions, is that I'll put in, this module that's responsible for designing or developing, and I would take away the mouse and say, okay, try to accomplish this task. And you'll see that they'll be frustrated really quick and really learn from their wrongs just by doing that simple task. And to your point, Marcel, like I think a lot of what I do, right, when there's a use case or disability that I might not understand, YouTube is my go-to, and that there's a bunch of videos about these assistive technology users where they'll walk you through how they use technology, how they accomplish certain tasks. And I think for me, it's always, not the silver bullet to like really empathizing with the situation, but like it gives me a really good head start and understanding of what it is that we might have to learn to support. So I think YouTube videos, right, another very powerful tool.
Right. So one quick plug, I am working on someone who I met in UK. She's blind, and I'm trying to connect her with our community, just so she can give us a session like we're doing with Alex, where we allow all the designers to ask how the life of a blind user is like, and just so you can start thinking about how to design better interfaces for the blind. So.
And at least for me, like I said, support has become like a very big demand for Zoom since COVID hit. But I think I've seen a lot of users, right, come to our disability, answer email and like ask questions about issues they're experiencing. And I think I always take the opportunity to jump on a Zoom call, screen share, see how they're interacting with, the interface or so on and so forth. And just a quick 30-minute session, right? I can write like 10 requirements for how we can improve things. And I think, where video conferencing right now is easy, right? I would definitely recommend like jumping on a call, seeing if someone has an issue, right? Walking through it, right? Try to be their guide, their eyes to however accessible or inaccessible the website is. And from that, you'll gain tremendous experience, like just through like this informal type of guerrilla research.
I want to give a call out to one of the attendees that we have today, who is Sam Prue, and he's from Fable Tech. And Sam does a lot of software testing. I think he may have even worked with you folks over Zoom. And I just want to give Sam like just a minute or two to ask a question if you want of Alex. But I just wanted to point him out. I mean, he's here. He's very active. He's a blind tester. I wish I could do more work with him. But I just want to see if you had a question by chance.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, Sam.
I'm thrilled to be here. Always love the opportunity that I get to work with everyone. I mean, just a word of congratulation, really, for you folks at Zoom. What we do at Fable, being focused on remote user testing with folks who have disabilities, Zoom is really baked into our workflow very deeply, and that wouldn't have been possible without Zoom's commitment to accessibility.
Absolutely.
And I mean, one thing that I was sort of wondering about, and wondering how you manage it, is like, there's sometimes this idea that like security and accessibility are in conflict, right? So the more secure you make a system, the harder it is to use, less accessible it is. More accessible products are less secure. And I know that Zoom has been doing a lot of work on security recently. And so I was wondering if the accessibility team has been at that table, has had a seat at that table, and kind of what some of the takeaways are that you guys have found and that you guys have discovered about the most accessible ways to do security, or like how you kind of manage those two needs.
Yeah, that's a big question, one that I don't honestly have an easy answer to. I'd say that I do not have a seat at that table when it comes to these decisions. Like, a big issue that came upon me was the accessibility CAPTCHA. Flows that I was familiar with for being accessible, right, suddenly had CAPTCHA in a way that I just didn't realize overnight. And it's been a battle in terms of, keeping track of all these changes. And I think we've been very reactive in this sense, right? We haven't been as proactive as I'd like in terms of balancing security and accessibility. But, Zoom was originated as an accessibility first company, in the sense that we wanted a frictionless experience. And right now, I think we're going through growing pains and figuring out how do we meld these two principles of accessibility and simplicity with the security-minded aspect of it. And I think, it's a large question, one that I don't have an answer to, and I wish that I would maybe in the next year, in terms of how can we have a seat at the table and provide our voice of accessibility. There's like things like waiting room passwords, right? I've gotten like a lot of backlash over it, right? Requiring all of that. But they were just things out of my control. And I think it's a challenge because we deeply ingrain accessibility into the development process. But when it comes to these new processes that are occurring, right, we have to like find our way into these meetings per se and provide our voice. And I think we're not there yet.
So would you say that the trade-off between security and accessibility is an occasional one, it's a frequent one, or it's almost all the time?
It's, I wouldn't say all the time, but I've seen so far that definitely, all these features that listed off, waiting room passwords, being able to unmute someone, CAPTCHA, all these different things have made it more difficult to, they just added more steps into participating in a Zoom meeting. And we try our best, right, to make all of these new features accessible, right, technically accessible, but even in adding steps, right, one wrong keystroke, whatever, will make things a lot more difficult. And so we try our best to make these new security features accessible, but it doesn't mean the whole flow would become accessible. It's been a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So one question that I get all the time from the community is how do we attach with people with disability? And I just want to take the opportunity that Sam is here with us. Is Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about Fable Tech Labs and how you are involved with them, just briefly, because we have a community of designers trying, and we are pushing that very hardly on how to leverage accessibility, design for accessibility. Can you do a quick plug on what Fable Tech Labs does and how you are involved with them?
Sure, certainly. So I am the community manager at Fable Tech Labs. And so that means that I focus on recruiting the diverse community of testers who work with us at Fable. We've got folks who use screen readers. We work with folks who use screen magnification. We work with folks who use switch systems, voice recognition, eye gaze, all of that stuff from across Canada and the United States. And what we focus on doing is making it easy for companies to have your products tested and your experiences tested by people who actually use assistive technology and who are people who live with a disability on a daily basis. And so instead of you trying to have to sort of load up these technologies and learn them from scratch, you can actually get real insights from the actual users of these products. You can find us at makeitfable.com. You can certainly find me as well on LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with any of you and sort of tell you more about what Fable does and how we do it, because I mean, every day I get to work at a business that is changing the world, because when you give people with disabilities a voice in the design process and in the testing process, that's really how you can learn and can know what improvements to make and sort of the best ways to make them.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming. We're definitely going to be in touch with you and Abid. Try to do a session for the community just to showcase Fable Tech Labs and the service. I think that would be amazing.
Right, 100%. We would love to have you guys come here and speak to us, at another one of these meetups. It would definitely be our privilege to have you guys here, for sure.
Love to. The one silver lining of doing these things on Zoom, I know it may not be in person like we're all used to, but it makes a lot more things accessible to a lot more folks.
Exactly.
We're definitely going to be using Zoom for that one. Alex, so we do have a couple of other questions. There are some technical questions. Derek May, or me, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name properly.
Hey, Marcelo, hey, Claudio, and
hey.
Great to meet everyone. And I'm calling in from Boston. I work for a company called Third Play Media. We focus on captioning and transcription. We're also a company that focuses a lot on accessibility, and you can take a chance to read that question. I'll try to paraphrase it, and some of the work that we're doing and the way that we interface with Zoom and trying to get as many people using the closed captioning service on Zoom as possible. We've heard from our user base as well as from other users in the accessibility space, as well as for people using Zoom for webinars and conferences and meetings, that there tends to be some type of, I guess, like experience blocker, where when people are going into Zoom and trying to schedule captions, there's no really easy or simple way to do that unless you train your staff or train your students or whoever's going into your meetings to copy that API token and then really distribute it. And there's usually some type of stream key and stream URL there as well. I know that Zoom probably has some type of partnership with Otter AI. I know that you guys have been using them to get a lot of stuff auto captioned, but I guess in the roadmap or in the backlog, is there any plan to add that retrieval of the API token to your documentation so that some of these other companies can leverage that and pull that automatically so that users don't have to do it themselves?
Right. It's I mentioned this earlier, but like I said, like CART, support for CART is one of my big initiatives, right? I don't think automatic captioning is a replacement for CART. And I think in a lot of ways, I understand that we're lacking in the sense of providing a good user experience for not just the captioner, but the scheduler, the meeting host. And right now, with the way we do tokens, right, there's a lot of juggling involved in between the three parties, which create, an issue where there isn't captioning for Zoom. And so I totally get the use case. Whether we do it through an API or not, I think we have to step back and think about the root cause. There are different ways to perhaps handle the situation. We already have a feature, right? We can invite interpreters on the call, like English to French, French Chinese, right? There's already existing flows for inviting interpreters. And I'm looking at it, right? What if we had something similar for closed captioning, right? What if we do, it doesn't necessarily have to be through an API, but there's a bunch of different ways we could address these issues. But I think what needs to be done by us is just to look at it from the root cause perspective first. And so I hear you in terms of the issues. I totally understand them. I've spoken with actually other caption companies that express the same issues. But whether or not that's done through an API implementation, right? It's a potential solution, but I think we have to keep going back to the drawing board and seeing what the root cause is, and if there's any other ways to address this in a more graceful manner.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I'd love to connect with you more to chat more about, I guess, the nuances of what we're trying to do, as well as give you feedback from others that are in the same space. We're also in the process of exploring CART captioning, working with people who are like real time and going into the event. But if you look at some of these other platforms such as Microsoft Teams or even Google, they have that automated captioning that just pops up through a single click and doesn't require any type of manual intervention there. So definitely would love to chat more about that. But thanks for the insight there.
Thanks, Derek. Any other questions you see, Claudio?
No, I was just looking, unless somebody wants to jump in and chime in right now, but I know.
I'd be surprised Joe doesn't have a question.
Yes, I was trying to make sure that everyone has there's so many interesting questions in the chat, I think, but primarily I think, Alex, just want to thank you for kind of joining us, and I think you mentioned a couple of things that kind of keep you up at night. You mentioned a little bit about your background and how you were able to build that empathetic approach and into everything that you do. I'm wondering if you can share with the group here, is there anything specific that you can think of that you've learned while you've been at Zoom? And I guess as a follow-up to that, like knowing what you know now and knowing everything that's been going on, not only within the accessibility community, but everything that's been going through at Zoom, like what would you tell your previous self, right, from like, let's say a year or 2 years ago, to prepare to do the work that you're doing now?
I think what my past self was 2 years ago, but I think working at Zoom, I think I've really learned the importance of culture, in the sense that, I think a per meeting culture principle that a lot of us Zoomies follow is delivering happiness and caring for others, whether that's for the user, our coworkers, right? Caring for users, it makes everyone at Zoom listen. And I think in these use cases, right, where we're not users with disabilities, we really have to listen, because otherwise there's no way we would know what to build. And I think this permeates with me, my team, product team, designers, right, engineers even. We always try to listen to the user needs. In terms of like caring for one another as a coworker, right, it also makes my job easier in the sense that it's the cross-functional aspect of it. Having people care for like my own projects and my initiatives, right, it makes it easy to like drive things. And I think a lot of what makes Zoom successful is definitely the culture of caring. And I think, if I was to tell myself 2 years ago, right, what I learned right now, right, it would be just to care more for those around me.
That's awesome.
Wow, that's a great answer. You know, if it sounds like you already came into a culture of caring to begin with, and like you didn't have to make cultural change happen to get people to care about people with disabilities. Would you say that was the case?
Absolutely. I think, again, like it came down from the CEO himself, right? The Accessibility Initiative. And he himself didn't have knowledge in the field, but listening to the customers he worked with in higher ed and a lot of the accessibility experts that talked about the experiences that they were having, right? You could see, from the leadership that there is a caring for these user needs and the listening for things that are not going smoothly, that things that don't make customers happy. And it permeates down to every single team member. And so I think it makes it easier for me to drive certain things within Zoom because people will listen to you, they'll care for you, and they'll care for the needs of the users. And that in itself, right, is very powerful in getting things done and getting initiatives done.
Alex, is there any advice you would give to somebody who is, say, like fresh out of a tech boot camp, or somebody who has like 1 or 2 years experience in UX, but is interested in getting into accessibility? Would you have any sort of advice?
It's hard. I think I look back in my experience in my road to where I am right now, and I've been incredibly fortunate to land in a university where accessibility is so ingrained in a lot of the processes. And I know that's not the case in other communities. That it's still, the word is still kind of spreading, right? It's not there yet. It's not in the process, and so it's hard for me to say follow my my footsteps because it might not be available elsewhere. But I think just taking the initiative to learn, right? To learn and to talk to someone else about what accessibility is, because once someone learns about it and learns about the humanitarian aspect, learns about what the barrier is, it's hard to like let go of the idea and sleep comfortably at night knowing that there's a barrier. And so I'd say learn for yourself, educate someone else about it, and that's that's the most you can do, honestly, to like help build accessibility. Because if the accessibility community grows, right, it'll make your job easier in the sense that there can be pressure from all different ends to make your leadership here for accessibility. There's gonna be more education for accessibility, and so it's important to like share and grow the accessibility working community.
Awesome. Alex, I can't even begin to thank you enough. I mean, you've answered probably more questions in the last hour and a half than somebody would at a Senate hearing. So you must be exhausted. You must be tired. I don't see any last minute questions here, but I want to give you a huge thank you on behalf of us and the whole South Florida community. Joel, I didn't know if you wanted to do some closing remarks or maybe talk about our next meetup. Marcelo, that's coming up in 3 weeks. But huge.
I think just from that to add on, and Marcelo, feel free to kind of chime in. We had started some of the initiatives as part of IxDA with the whole state of UX, and we're going to be publishing our new event, and we're kind of be tag teaming that with the work that I know Marcelo's doing, for UX and fajitas now. And so we'll go ahead and kind of send that out to all of our list. But I think primarily just want to second, kind of what Claudia was saying. Alex, thank you so much for being so gracious with your time. And I think, as a community that's continuing to grow and expand, and I think more importantly, there's that level of interest, definitely having your insights today, something that people can see, what the accessibility culture that you come from looks like, and more importantly, what we can aspire to all as designers, as creatives. So definitely thank you for that. And Marcelo, with that, I kind of kick it off to you, and maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about what you're doing at UX and Fajitas coming up.
Sure. Let me know if there's a lot of noise here because my wife got home and I got kicked out of the living room.
But you have an awesome view.
But anyways, no, I just wanna thank Alex so much, and for everyone who's attending. I think this is part of it's part of who we are as a South Florida communities, like learning together. I think don't mean to present ourselves as experts. We're always learning. We're always learning together. And thank you so much, Alex, for all the time that you have spent, not only today. So we've been chatting like for days now and trying to figure out what would be the best way to bring the Zoom knowledge and accessibility to the community. So I'm really looking forward to see what Zoom has to offer in the future. I have to say, coming from other platforms, and now after the COVID, the pandemic, I'm kind of using Zoom almost every day for talks and for community work, and I'm very impressed with how much this product can offer. And that's it. So, Alex, you want to do your closing remarks?
No, thank you. You guys have been incredibly welcoming. I've had an incredible time here talking to you guys. And who knows, maybe I'll be back in a future talk and definitely keep in touch.
I'm definitely curious to see how the captioning will evolve in terms of design. So it definitely works. It's a great feature, but what's the best user experience for someone, and for the signing feature as well, the signing language. I think that would be a very incredible feature to showcase to the community.
Absolutely.